The lambasted and atrocious Zelda's Adventure for the Phillips CD-i now has a Game Boy demake by John Lay. Is it any good? Is it the ultimate way to play this long-forgotten title? We'll find out, but first, a bit of backstory on the game.
Zelda's Adventure is the third title in what's been dubbed the Unholy Triforce, the three licensed Legend of Zelda games from the ill-fated Phillips CD-i. Faces of Evil and Wand of Gamelon are the ones most people remember, and were released simultaneously. Both take inspiration from Zelda 2. They were side-scrolling adventures on a beautiful yet confusing backdrop. The scenery would be great for a painting, terrible for navigating a character. The games also suffered from control issues, and cheap deaths, and confusing objectives, and really the list just goes on.
And on.
And on.
And on. The beat goes on. Many believed Zelda's Adventure would remedy these issues, taking a top-down approach akin to the traditional 2D Zelda formula. And we actually reviewed this game back in 2015, way back when. And although we found it to be better than the side-scrolling games, it was still very rough.
I would more describe it as like a side grade. There were some things that got better, but then a whole bunch of other things that got worse. There were many issues, but our primary complaints can be boiled down to the following.
So there are a ton of items here, but only 2 non-D-pad buttons in play. One for all actions, and I do mean all actions, and one to pull up the menu. Phillips wanted the game to be compatible with all controllers, and not every controller had 3 or more face buttons. However, some did, and there should have been an option to take advantage of these to avoid tediously pulling up the menu over and over again to swap items. Though, toward the end game, there are just so many items that I'm not even sure that it would have made that much of a difference, but in the beginning of the game, it would have been at least a bit helpful.
Bit of a Link's Awakening scenario.
Yes.
Where there's a whole bunch of items and just the one... Well, there's 2 items you can swap around, but you kind of always need your sword. You don't always need your shield. You don't always need this, but it's like, man, you need to be able to jump. You need to be able to do all these other things. Yeah. And like having to just swap through menus, it gets sometimes like the Metal Gear Solid 3 endlessly going into menus to change your camo and fix various things.
Imagine that, but worse.
The backgrounds and objects in the game are all from photographs and videos. They used a massive amount of the already limited RAM the CD-i had available. The developers wanted the game to look impressive, but it ate so much RAM that the scrolling, or more accurately loading from screen to screen, becomes unbearable, especially if you need to backtrack or accidentally exit a screen and need to return.
Now lastly in our list of primary complaints is the nonsensical game design. It's simply confusing. Where to go, what to do, what enemies are weak against which of the many weapons, etc., etc. The hints are cryptic and you absolutely need a guide or a deep, deep sense of wanderlust. Combine this with the above mentioned loading times and you've got a frustrating experience.
I feel with a lot of NES games, like, there was a lot of the way you discover stuff is talking to the other kids at the playground.
Mm-hmm.
Like, go to this screen, try shooting fire at the trees. And then you're like, oh, I found one of the secret spots in Zelda.
Yeah.
But that was cool then. It's insanely annoying now.
Yeah. Well...
because, you're just playing the game by yourself. You're not going to lunch tomorrow on the playground. I mean, if I showed up at a playground, I'd probably just get arrested.
You sure would. You sure would. Well, an additional point along those lines is that the original NES Legend of Zelda, was it cryptic? Sure. Yes, it was.
Yeah.
However, did the moment-to-moment gameplay give you satisfaction?
Yes.
Yes, the combat was satisfying. Mm-hmm. It felt good to explore.
Yeah.
This doesn't have that.
No, it doesn't. Back to the Game Boy port/demake. Beyond the incredible loading times, which of these issues can it remedy? Is it a serious upgrade, or does it merely just adjust small things to make it the preferred way to play? Does it have better music? Does combat feel better? Let's find out.
Let's talk about one of the biggest elephants in the room, the presentational differences. Obviously, this is significantly different, but it's also a lot cleaner. You know, this is Link's Awakening-esque.
The original Zelda's Adventure was designed to, like, showcase what the system could do, push it to its absolute limit. But unfortunately, what it really did was just showed the seams really, really clearly. Like, hey, you could push it this far, but it'll run like garbage if you do.
Now, of course, instead of voiceover, you're going to be getting text, which is probably a good thing for most people. I'm sure some people found the voices endearing in the original game, but a lot of it was quite hokey, quite creepy, quite strange. Here you can put any sort of personality you want to it because it's just text.
Please attend me. A traveler of kind intentions has found me at last. I am collapsed with thirst and dryness.
The remake also brings it much more in line with the canon Zelda series. In the original game, the enemies are more so artist interpretations, if you will. And lastly, with presentation, we also have, well, music. In Zelda's Adventure, most of the sound you hear are like birds, wind, steps, water flowing.
Come here, bright young lady. I have a wonderful bargain for you.
It doesn't exactly rile you up for adventure. Combat feel is very funny in that you don't really get a sound effect. And you also get glitches occasionally in this, and
Hey Dev, there's your clean pick. So combat in this game is clunky, mushy, not solid, doesn't have that nice snap. Like, you really need some good positive reinforcement, both, like, visually and, you know, sound-wise.
I feel like they're trying to be faithful to the source material, which is also very mushy and unsatisfying in terms of combat, but I feel like they don't have to be.
Yeah.
I feel like this has an opportunity to be snappy and fun, because the rest of the game won't be. So the combat might as well be snappy and fun. Right now, the combat basically just feels like nothing. I can't tell if I'm getting hit, I can't tell if I'm hitting, other than the little exclamation points that are popping up.
Yeah. Clunky, mushy, crashy. And like everything just kind of feels like I'm moving on a grid. Like I can't move past this without picking it up.
So an interesting thing happened here, John.
Yeah.
In the original game, you had to go to the source of the river, you had to press start, select your bottle, press the button, it dropped it, it filled, you had to pick it back up. Here, I didn't do any of that. I just went to the source of the river and my bottle was filled up. Now I have to return to that individual, give her her water. Bless you, princess, you have saved the life of a weary old woman. I offer you these treasures. So again, before, in the previous game, you had to actually select the bottle and give it back to her. All of the spells, including using items like the boomerang, which are referred to as the boomerang spell, use rupees.
Oh god, I just remembered that. That's horrible.
Yeah, it's like the original Zelda, which wasn't ideal.
It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't that bad.
One of the pitfalls of this shrine in Zelda's Adventure was the confusing look of the dungeon. So, for example, here's a chasm I need to put a ladder over. Okay, so that exists in the original game. But then in one of the following screens, there's a chasm that you can't put a ladder on. But wait a minute, it's not a chasm. It's just something in the foreground. I remember sitting there for a while trying to put the ladder down, and it just wouldn't go down.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't needed. It was just something in the foreground. You couldn't tell the difference.
And this game was clunky enough that you weren't sure if you just weren't doing it at the right spot. Was it just being too picky?
Yeah.
Like, it was impossible to know if you were actually doing it wrong.
Yeah, exactly. But here, because it's been redesigned, you don't have that issue. There were also a bunch of dead ends in the original game, and it was brutal because of the load times. So, for example, this dead end existed, but it's like, oh...
There goes a minute of your life.
It's like, come on. Here, it's really not that big of a deal. It's still dumb, gameplay-wise, but it's not brutal. So the Jade Ring spell is seemingly the only way to kill these mini-bosses. I mean, I hit them a million times with everything I had.
Yeah.
But I hit them twice or whatever with the Jade Ring, boom, dead. However, you can't use it against the boss of this dungeon, it's useless. Does basically no damage.
Yeah.
So the weapon you get in the dungeon is useless against the main boss of the dungeon. When we were talking about that nonsensical game design earlier, this is one of those things we were talking about. As we mentioned before, the gameplay is pretty true to the original in that there are just like a bajillion items. We've only been playing for about like an hour or and a half or two, maybe at most. And look how many items we've acquired.
Yeah, that's a lot.
It's a much more of a slow burn with very like meticulous uses for each item in the canon Legend of Zelda games.
Yeah.
Here, it's just sort of willy-nilly.
Yeah, or maybe they might give you a few different items at the start, but they'll be pretty well defined as to what does what. It's a weapon.
Okay.
Don't know what it does. Let's see. Oh god, that uses a lot. Okay, well that's the most expensive weapon we own.
So, John,
Yeah.
before we wrap up here, I'm going to do a challenge for us. Let's think of 4 ways the creator can make this a better game, better than the original, beyond what he's already done. Okay, so we deliberated. Here are our 4 ways to improve the game, plus an added bonus honorable mention. John, why don't you go first?
So I would say snappier combat instead of just from one side with your wand. Maybe a little bit more of like, make it a little bit more like a, the old Link blade attack, which is kind of like a 45-degree cone in front of you. It sucks because sometimes I could be like, oh, I'm missing Tony because I'm not.
Yeah.
Ah, there we are.
There's just not a lot of feedback.
Yeah.
Either. I want more feedback, sound effects, etc. Number 2, auto pickups for items. So in normal Zelda games, you just walk over a heart, boom, little sound effect, you got it. It may not have been clear here, but you had to interact with and press the action button every time you picked up a heart or a rupee or whatever. It makes it a little bit more tedious. You should just be able to auto pick up anything and everything that you need to pick up.
I would say change how sort of the weapon economy works. So some items cost way too much to use. So it kind of makes them not really worth using most of the time, especially with some enemies just being like, oh, I'm immune to that.
Now, if you combined that better weapon economy with the snappier combat that you mentioned earlier, you could really have a lot of fun with the combat and just mowing down swaths of enemies. The thing is that this game really isn't a great Zelda game. It really actually reminds me more of like a Zelda randomizer than anything else. But that can still be fun when you have great combat. And you can play in this sandbox, but it doesn't really allow you to play.
So this one is just like a randomizer, but it's all the bad rooms.
Yeah, pretty much.
But that's what the original game was. So.
Yeah. Now, lastly, would be better use of the buttons. In the Phillips CD-i game, you had one action button for every item. It's the same thing here, but you have an A and a B button. Both should be usable and mappable. You should be able to have your weapon on one and a sub-weapon on the other. And then you start and select for something else.
Yeah, and just do it when you're close to somebody, that it just auto-switches it to an interact.
Yeah, exactly. Honorable mention, more music. There's a couple different tracks, but they get a little repetitive. So just varying it up a little bit more, golden. And there's a lot to choose from. A lot of portable, handheld Zelda, Game Boy Zelda goodness to choose from.
I will say, given how much work you seem to have put into this, I'm sure you are working on that.
Yeah.
So I do look forward to seeing that.
Yeah.
And I would say that you've already made the game infinitely more playable.
Oh, yes. These critiques and suggestions are not to be taken as a negative.
Yeah.
At all.
Yeah,
I think
you've really improved
I think this is a significant improvement, and kudos to you, excellent work. But these are just sort of our takeaways in terms of like, if we were tinkering with it, here's how we'd make these adjustments. Because you're already deviating from the main game, so why not deviate to make it even better? Thank you everybody for watching, and thank you to the creator for making this game way more accessible.
Yeah. As soon as I heard the concept of like what you were doing, I was like, oh, okay, good. That's going to remove most of my complaints of the game.
Phillips CD-i emulation is tricky, difficult, cumbersome, and not really worth it. So having this game be downloadable Or you can also just play it in browser. Removes so many barriers for entry for Zelda's Adventure, and it just is going to make it so much easier for so many more people to experience this awful game. All right, so thank you very much, everybody, for watching. Thank you for subscribing, hitting that notification bell, all that good stuff. Join us on Patreon if you would like.
Only $1 to join the Discord.
Get those dank memes, son, and hope to see you all back for the next one. Cheers.
Clink.